One forbidden moment in a shared hotel room unraveled the fragile TI of family, igniting a passion we couldn't resist and a love we could never admit. The family trip to the secluded mountain resort had been my stepmother's idea, a way to bond before the chaos of wedding planning consumed everyone. Darren, my future husband, hadn't been able to come citing work commitments, and so it was just the four of us, me, my father, my stepmother, and Jack, my stepbrother. The resort was beautiful, nestled high in the hills with breathtaking views of pine forests stretching as far as the eye could see. The air was cool and crisp, a refreshing change from the humid city heat, but my excitement about the trip was dampened the moment I saw the room arrangements. Clara and Jack will share this room, my stepmother announced, handing me one of the 2 keys she held. Your father and I will be just down the hall. I opened my mouth to protest, but quickly thought better of it. The look on my stepmother's face made it clear this wasn't up for debate. I glanced at Jack, who simply shrugged a faint smirk, tugging at his lips. The room was cozy, but not spacious enough to avoid the awkwardness of sharing it. A single queen-sized bed dominated the space, though it was mercifully flanked by a small sofa. Jack tossed his bag onto the sofa immediately, as if staking his claim. I'll take the couch, he said, his voice casual. Thanks. I muttered, feeling the tension already building. Jack and I had never been close. Our parents had married when we were teenagers, and though we were polite enough to each other in front of them, there was an unspoken friction that always lingered between us. Jack had always been the charismatic, confident one, while I was more reserved. I tried to shake off the awkwardness as I unpacked, pulling out my phone to call Darren. Hey, babe. Darren's familiar voice greeted me. Hi, I I'd sinking onto the bed and letting his warmth wash over me. How's work? I miss you. Jack sprawled on the couch, pretended to scroll through his phone, but I could feel his presence, the weight of his gaze flickering toward me every so often were slammed. Darren admitted, his voice tinged with exhaustion, but I can't wait to see you next week. How's the trip so far? It's fine, I said, glancing at Jack, who raised an eyebrow, as if daring me to elaborate. Quiet. The resort is beautiful. I wish I could be there. Darren said wistfully, me too. I replied, my voice soft. The conversation continued, filled with the kind of mundane details that couples share when they miss each other. But despite Darren's reassuring words, I felt a strange discomfort. I couldn't place a restlessness that seemed to grow with each passing moment. When I finally ended the call, I set the phone on the nightstand and turned to find Jack watching me, what I snapped more sharply than I intended. He shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. Nothing. Just wondering if you always talk to him like that. Like what? Like you're trying to convince yourself you're happy. He said, his tone light, but cutting. I glared at him. You don't know anything about my relationship, maybe not, he said, sitting up and leaning forward. But I know you. I turned away, refusing to engage. Jack had always had a way of getting under my skin, of saying just the right thing to make me doubt myself. The evening passed uneventful. We had dinner with my father and stepmother in the resort's dining hall, making polite conversation while I did my best to ignore Jack's occasional glances. Back in the room, I changed into pajamas and climbed into bed, determined to put the day behind me. Jack was as usual, laying on the couch, scrolling through his phone, the soft glow of the screen, the only light in the room. I rolled onto my side facing the wall, but sleep didn't come. I was hyper-aware of Jack's presence, of the sound of his breathing, the rustle of the blanket as he shifted. Clara, he said, suddenly, his voice low in the quiet room. I didn't answer. Are you awake? He asked. I turned over, reluctantly meeting his gaze in the dim light. What is it? Jack? For a moment he didn't say anything, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled faintly. Nothing. Just you seem different when he's not around. I frowned. What are you talking about? You're more real, he said. Less perfect. I stared at him, my heart racing for reasons I didn't understand. Go to sleep. Jack. He didn't respond, but his eyes lingered on mine for a moment longer before he turned away. The next day was a whirlwind of family activities, hiking, sightseeing, lunch at a scenic cafe, but the tension between Jack and me remained. We avoided each other as much as possible, careful not to let our parents notice anything unusual. By the time we returned to the hotel, I was exhausted both physically and emotionally. My father and stepmother went straight to their room, leaving Jack and me alone once more. As I opened the door to our room, I felt his presence behind me close enough that I could hear his breath. I stepped inside quickly, putting distance between us. "I'm going to shower," I said, not looking at him. "Go ahead," he said, his tone casual. I lingered in the bathroom longer than necessary, trying to steady myself. But when I emerged, Jack was sitting on the edge of the bed, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "We need to talk," he said. I hesitated. What about yesterday?" he said, standing and taking a step closer. "About this." "There is no this," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "Whatever you're thinking." "I'm not thinking anything," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm feeling, and so are you, Jack." He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you don't feel it too." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come because deep down I knew he was right before I could stop him or myself. His lips were on mine, soft and urgent. I froze for a moment, my mind screaming at me to push him away to stop this before it went too far. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hands clutching at his shirt, as if it was the only thing keeping me grounded. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, I let myself go. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, the weight of what we'd done settling over us like a storm cloud. "This can't happen," I whispered, my voice shaking. Jack cupped my face in his hands, his eyes searching mine. "It already did." I pulled away, turning my back to him. "We have to forget this. We can't let it happen again." Neither of us spoke for a long time. When I finally climbed into bed, I felt Jack's presence on the couch, as heavy and inescapable as the guilt that gnawed at me that night I barely slept. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, guilt, fear, and something else I couldn't name. I knew what we'd done was wrong. I knew it could never happen again. But as the first light of dawn crept through the window, one thought lingered, clear and undeniable. I didn't regret it. The morning after the kiss, I woke to the soft hum of birds outside the window. For a fleeting moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But when I opened my eyes and saw Jack sitting on the edge of the couch, his hair messy, his expression distant, reality came crashing back. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to pretend nothing had happened, but the weight of what we'd done hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. "Morning," Jack said finally, his voice quiet. "Morning." I mumbled, my throat dry. I kept my gaze averted, focusing on the blanket bunched up in my lap. For the rest of the morning, we avoided each other. I busied myself with getting dressed and brushing my hair, while Jack stayed glued to his phone, scrolling aimlessly. Neither of us mentioned the kiss, and neither of us dared to meet the other's eyes. At breakfast, we joined my father and stepmother at the resort's dining hall. The clicking of silverware and the low murmur of other diners filled the space, but I barely tasted the food in front of me, every time Jack's hand brushed against mine. As we reached for the coffee pot, my pulse quickened. "Clara, you seem distracted," my stepmother said, raising an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile, just tired from all the hiking yesterday. She said, unconvinced, before turning her attention to my father. I felt Jack's gaze flicker toward me, but I refused to look at him. After breakfast, we spent the day on another family outing, this time exploring a nearby lake. The four of us rented a paddle boat, the quiet serenity of the water, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. Jack and I kept our distance, careful to interact as little as possible. But no matter how much I tried to push the memory of the kiss out of my mind, it refused to leave. I found myself replaying it over and over, my emotions a confusing mix of guilt, shame, and longing. Darren's face flashed in my mind more times than I could count, but it wasn't enough to quell the fluttering in my chest whenever Jack glanced my way. That evening, we returned to the hotel, exhausted from the day's activities. My father and stepmother went to their room, leaving Jack and me alone. Once again, the silence in our shared room was deafening. I sat on the bed, scrolling through my phone in a futile attempt to distract myself while Jack sat on the couch staring at the floor. "We need to talk," he said, suddenly breaking the silence. I froze, my fingers hovering over the screen. "About what?" "You know what he said, standing and crossing the small room to stand in front of me. We can't just pretend it didn't happen." I looked up at him, my heart racing. "Jack, it was a mistake, we shouldn't have. Don't do that." He interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "Don't act like it didn't mean anything." "It didn't," I said. Though my voice lacked conviction, he crouched down, so we were at eye level, his gaze searching mine. "Clara, stop lying to yourself. I felt it, and I know you did too." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come because he was right. I had felt something I couldn't explain, something that scared me. "This is wrong," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You're my stepbrother. I'm engaged. We can't." "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice softening, "but that doesn't change how I feel." I stared at him, my mind spinning. "How do you feel?" Jack hesitated, his jaw tightening as though he was debating whether to say the words aloud, but then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I care about you, Clara, more than I should." My breath caught my chest tightening. "Jack, I know it's complicated," he said quickly, "but I can't stop thinking about you, about us." "There is no us," I said, though the words felt hollow. "There can't be." He reached out his hand, brushing against mine. "Then why haven't you pushed me away?" I didn't have an answer. I wanted to tell him it was because I was confused, because I didn't know how to handle what had happened. But the truth was, part of me didn't want to push him away. Part of me wanted to close the distance between us and feel his lips on mine again. Without thinking, I leaned forward, closing the gap between us. Our lips met, and all the fear and confusion melted away, replaced by a raw, undeniable need. His hands cupped my face, pulling me closer, and for a moment I let myself get lost in the intensity of the kiss. When we finally pulled apart, I felt tears pickling at the corners of my eyes. "This is crazy," I whispered. "Maybe," he said, his forehead resting against mine, "but it's real." The days that followed were a mix of stolen glances and secret touches. We were careful not to let our parents notice anything unusual, but every moment alone together was charged with an intensity that neither of us could deny. At night, when the rest of the resort was quiet, we would talk in hushed voices, sharing pieces of ourselves we'd never shared before. I learned things about Jack. I'd never known his dreams, his fears, his insecurities, and with each conversation I felt myself falling deeper, but the guilt never left. Every time Darren called, his voice full of love and excitement about our wedding, I felt like a terrible person. I wanted to tell him the truth, to end things before they went any further, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Darren represented stability, safety, everything I thought I wanted. But Jack was something else entirely. One evening, Jack and I found ourselves sitting on the balcony of our room, the cool night air wrapping around us. The stars above were brilliant, casting a soft glow over the landscape. "Do you regret it?" Jack asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to look at H.M., my heart aching at the vulnerability in his eyes. "No," I admitted, "but I wish I did." He smiled faintly, reaching for my hand. "I don't regret it either." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our situation hanging heavy between us. I knew this couldn't last. Sooner or later, we'd have to face reality. But for now, I let myself enjoy the fleeting moments of stolen happiness, even as they threatened to tear my world apart. The tension of secrecy hung between us, like a fragile thread growing tighter with every passing day. Jack and I were careful, slipping between moments of normalcy around our parents and stolen moments of intimacy when no one was looking. Every glance, every accidental touch held the weight of what we couldn't say aloud. I had always been good at keeping my composure, but this was different. Every time my father or stepmother looked at me, I felt like they could see right through me, like they knew the truth about what was happening behind closed doors. One morning we sat together at breakfast, the four of us at a table overlooking the misty mountains. My stepmother was discussing plans for a picnic near the woods later that day, her voice light and cheerful. "You'll love it," she said. Turning to me, "The forest here is absolutely beautiful, perfect for some fresh air and a little peace." I nodded, barely listening across the table. Jack was battering a piece of toast, his expression neutral, but I caught the flicker of a smirk when our eyes met. My cheeks flushed and I quickly looked away, hoping no one noticed Jack. "You're coming too right." My father asked, his tone more of a command than a question. "Of course," Jack replied smoothly. "Wouldn't miss it." The picnic was idyllic, exactly the kind of wholesome family outing my stepmother had envisioned. We spread a blanket on the soft grass near the edge of the woods, the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. My father and stepmother chatted away, laughing about old memories, while Jack and I exchanged stolen glances. Every time I felt his gaze on me, my pulse quickened. I couldn't help it. I wanted to stop, to pull myself back into the reality of my engagement to Darren and the family dynamics we were risking. But the pull-all toward Jack was magnetic, undeniable. After lunch, my father announced he was going to take a nap under the shade of a tree, and my stepmother said she'd read a book by the picnic blanket that left Jack and me free to explore the woods. Though neither of us said anything about it, it was unspoken, as most things between us had been. Lately, we walked in silence. The sounds of the forest surrounding us, birds chirped, leaves rustle underfoot, and the cool breeze carried the scent of pine. It was beautiful, but all I could focus on was Jack walking beside me, close enough that our arms brushed with every few steps. When we were deep enough into the woods that the voices from the picnic were a distant hum, Jack stopped and turned to me. "Clara," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything unsaid. I froze, my heart pounding. "Jack, we shouldn't." Before I could finish, he stepped closer, his hands gently cupping my face. His touch sent a shiver through me, and I hated how much I craved it. "Every second we're apart, I just want to be near you," he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. "Jack," my voice was barely audible, trembling with emotion. "This is wrong." "Then why does it feel so right?" he asked, his lips brushing against mine. I didn't have an answer, and when he kissed me, I didn't resist. I couldn't. His lips were soft, insistent, and every part of me melted into him, forgetting everything else. Darren, our parents, the consequences. The world faded around us. The only thing that mattered was him. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I lost myself in the intensity of the moment. But then a sound shattered the illusion, a sharp intake of breath followed by a voice I wished I hadn't heard. "Clara." I jerked away from Jack, my heart dropping to my stomach. Standing a few feet away was my stepmother, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God." She whispered, her voice shaking. "What is going on here, Mom?" Jack started, but she cut him off. "Don't," she snapped, her voice rising. "Don't even try to explain this." I felt like the ground had opened beneath me, swallowing me whole. Shame and panic coursed through me as I struggled to find the words to explain what was completely unexplainable. It's not what it looks like," I stammered, knowing how hollow the words sounded. "It's exactly what it looks like," she cried, her voice breaking. "I can't believe this. You're siblings. We're not siblings," Ja said sharply. "We're not related." "That doesn't matter," she yelled. "Your family is. This is disgusting." Her words cut like a knife, and I felt tears sting my eyes. Jack stepped in front of me protectively, his jaw tight. "Clara, go back to the picnic." He said, his voice calm but firm. Let me talk to her. I hesitated, but the look in his eyes told me to listen with trembling legs. I turned and walked back toward the clearing, my mind spinning. The atmosphere at the picnic was thick with tension. When I returned, my father was still napping, oblivious to the storm that was brewing, but I couldn't sit still. I paced near the edge of the blanket, waiting for Jack and my stepmother to return. When they finally did, my stepmother's face was tight with anger, and Jack's expression was unreadable. My father woke up confused by the sudden tension. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice groggy. "We need to talk," my stepmother said curtly, shooting a glare at Jack and me now. Back at the hotel, the four of us gathered in my parents' room. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands clenched in my lap, while Jack stood by the window, his arms crossed. My father and stepmother stood side by side, their disappointment palpable. "What were you thinking?" my father demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "How could you do this?" I couldn't meet his eyes. It just happened. "That's not an excuse," my stepmother snapped. "You're supposed to be getting married." Clara to Darren. "What about him? Do you even care about what this would do to him?" "Of course I care," I said, my voice breaking. "I never meant for this to happen, but it did," my father said coldly. "And now we have to deal with it." There was a long, heavy silence before my stepmother spoke again. "We're leaving tomorrow, and when we get back home, you two are going to be separated permanently." "What?" Ja said, his voice rising. "You can't just we can and we will," she said firmly. "This ends now." I felt like I couldn't breathe. The thought of being separated from Jack, of never seeing him again, was unbearable. But what could I say? They were right. This was wrong. It had to end that night back in our shared room. Jack and I sat in silence, the weight of the day pressing down on us. "This isn't over," he said, finally, his voice quiet but determined. "Jack," I started, but he shook his head. "I don't care what they say," he said. "We'll figure this out somehow." Tears filled my eyes and I looked away, unable to face him. "I don't know if we can." He reached for my hand, his touch gentle. "We can, because I love you, Clara, and I know you love me too." I didn't respond, but the tears that spilled down my cheeks said everything I couldn't. The weeks following our emotional meeting at the park were the hardest. Jack, Kay, and I tried to keep our distance, but the pull between us was magnetic, impossible to ignore. We exchanged a few furtive messages, each one reigniting the emotions we were both trying to bury, but eventually even those stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents were cautious, watching me more closely than ever. My stepmother asked probing questions about Darren, trying to redirect my focus to the wedding. My father remained stoic, his disappointment evident in the way he avoided meaningful conversations with me. They believed the separation was working, that Jack and I were moving on, but I wasn't moving on. I was barely holding myself together. One late evening, while the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. My heart raced when I saw Jack's name on the screen. "Can you meet me one last time?" I stared at the message, torn between the rational voice in my head and the aching in my heart. I knew what I should do, but my fingers moved before I could stop them, where his response was immediate. The old train station. Midnight that night, I crept out of the house, careful not to wake anyone. The streets were quiet, the air cool and still. As I made my way to the train station on the outskirts of town, the platform was abandoned, its once bright lights dim and flickering. Jack was already there, leaning against one of the rusted benches. When he saw me, his face softened, and for a moment the world around us disappeared. "You came," he said quietly. "I had to," I replied, my voice trembling. We stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other. There was so much I wanted to say, but I didn't know where to begin. "I don't think I can do this," I admitted finally, my voice breaking. I don't think I can pretend like you don't mean everything to me. Jack stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. But what do we do? I asked, tears spilling down my cheeks. We can't keep sneaking around. It's tearing me apart. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. Maybe we don't have to sneak around. Maybe we leave together. His words hung in the air, heavy with possibility for a brief, fleeting moment. I imagined it running, away, leaving everything behind to be with him. But the fantasy shattered as quickly as it came. We can't, I said, shaking my head. It's not just about us. It's about our family. Darren. Everyone we'd hurt, Jack's shoulders sagged and he let out a shaky breath. I don't care about any of that. All I care about is you. I reach for his hand, intertwining our fingers. I care about you too, but sometimes love isn't enough. We sat on the bench, our hands still clasped. As the night stretched on, we talked about everything, our fears, our regrets, our dreams of what could have been. And as the hours passed, the inevitability of our situation became clearer. When the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Jack turned to me, his eyes filled with sadness. This is goodbye, isn't it? I nodded, tears streaming down my face. It has to be. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly, as if he could somehow keep me there forever. I'll never stop loving you, Clara. I'll never stop loving you either, I whispered. We kissed one last time, a bittersweet mix of passion and pain, knowing it would be our final moment together. When we finally pulled apart, neither of us could speak. Jack watched me as I walked away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until I couldn't see him anymore. When I returned home, I crawled into bed, clutching my pillow as silent sobs racked my body. I had made the right choice of that. I was certain, but the right choice had felt so wrong. The days that followed were agonizing. I threw myself into wedding preparations, trying to distract myself from the ache in my chest. Darren was patient and loving, as always, blissfully unaware of the turmoil inside me. I tried to convince myself that I could move forward, that I could be happy with him, but a part of me would always belong to Jack. After the wedding, we finally decided to meet at a nearby cafe. The cafe was dimly lit, a quiet refuge tucked away from the world, far from prying eyes and judgmental whispers. Jack sat at a corner table, his eyes fixed on the door as if he'd willed me into existence. When I finally walked in, the look in his eyes made my breath catch a mixture of longing, sadness, and the same fire that had always burned between us. Clara, he said softly, as I approached, standing to greet me. Jack, I replied, my voice barely audible. We hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on us then, as if neither of us could stop ourselves. We embraced the familiarity of his touch, sent a rush of emotions through me, relief, longing, and the unbearable ache of knowing this couldn't last. The conversation started awkwardly, both of us dancing around the truth that had brought us back together. We talked about meaningless things, work, family, the weather, avoiding the unspoken question that lingered in the air. But Jack, as always, was the first to break the silence. I've missed you, he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. Every single day I looked down at my hands, twisting the edge of the napkin in front of me. I've missed you too, more than I can say. His hand reached across the table, brushing against mine. Then why are we here? Clara, why are we still pretending we can let each other go? Tears stung my eyes as I shook my head, because we have to. Jack, I'm married. I've made promises I can't break. Have you ever stopped to think about what you want? He asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Not what's right, not what everyone expects of you, but what you want. I don't know what I want, I admitted, my voice breaking. I know I love you, but I love Darren too, and he doesn't deserve this. Jack leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. So what do we do? Do we just keep living like this, pretending we're fine while we're both miserable? The question hung between us, suffocating in its simplicity. I didn't have an answer. I wanted to tell him we could find a way that love would conquer all, but I knew it wasn't true. Our love was beautiful, but it was also destructive, a flame that burned too hot to sustain. I don't know, I whispered, but I can't keep hurting everyone around me. Jack, I can't keep hurting you. He sighed, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had settled on them. Maybe that's the answer. Then maybe the only way to stop the pain is to end this. My heart clenched at his words. You don't mean that I don't want to mean it, he said, his voice cracking. But what choice do we have? We've tried everything, Clara, and it's only made things worse. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I reached for his hand, holding it tightly. I don't want to lose you. You'll never lose me, he said, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. You'll always have a piece of me, no matter where life takes us, and you'll always have mine, I whispered. We sat in silence for a long time, holding on to each other as if the world might crumble if we let go. Finally, Jack pulled me into his arms and I buried my face in his shoulder, inhaling the scent that was uniquely his. I wanted to memorize every detail, every second of this moment, knowing it would be the last. When we finally pulled apart, his eyes were wet with unshed tears. This isn't goodbye, he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion in it. Not really. You'll always be with me, Clara, and you'll always be with me, I said, my voice breaking. He leaned in, pressing one last kiss to my forehead, lingering as if he could somehow make it last forever. Then, without another word, he stood and walked away, leaving me sitting at the table with nothing but the memory of him. I sat there long after he left, letting the weight of our decisions settle over me. My heart ached, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange sense of peace. Jack was right, what we had was real, but it wasn't meant to last. Some loves burn too brightly, too intensely to survive the harshness of reality. As I made my way back home, I thought about the path ahead, the life I would continue building with Darren, the promises I would keep. It wasn't the life I had imagined, but it was the one I had chosen, and though Jack and I had parted, I knew a part of him would always stay with me. We had loved fiercely, recklessly, and against all odds. And even though we couldn't be together, our love had shaped us, leaving an indelible mark on both our hearts. Some stories don't have happy endings, but they still deserve to be told.